Um, Very good morning and welcome. Sorry for a little bit of the delay. We're just waiting for Ratin to show up. First of all, I'd like to welcome all of you for coming to what should be a very exciting half day. To our partners at ESID, particularly Kunal, who's sort of been, you know, very helpful and instrumental across a range of sort of projects we've been doing together. But most of all to Vasudha and her team for not just taking on an important subject, but bringing us together like this. So I'll just hand over the proceedings to Vasudha. The first session will run till about 11:30, and the format will be relatively straightforward. Vasudha's team will give a 20-minute presentation outlining the main argument of the first paper, which is the comparative analysis of the settlements of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. Then we'll have a panel discussion where the panelists will speak for about up to about 7 minutes each, something kind of commenting on the papers, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Just also want to remind you that there is a second panel and a very, very important, exciting panel, which is really on mining and extractive industries and the economics and politics of that. So many of the issues that come up in the morning will probably continue through that. So, judge your kind of questions accordingly. Maybe we can kind of bracket some of the mining stuff at least till that panel. So, just like to invite Vasudha.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pratap. Good morning, everyone. And before I start, I'd just like to take a few seconds to thank some very important people who have helped us do this project. So first of all, I'd like to thank ESID and Kunal Sen for commissioning this research, and CPR, Pratap and Yamini for anchoring it. Thank you. And NIPFP and Ratin Roy and Meeta Chaudhary and Dekha Chakrabarti for their very insightful collaboration on the fiscal aspects of this research. And most of all, I'd like to thank my wonderful associates, Andita Adhikari, Vidushi Bahuguna, for working tirelessly, and various others from the CPR team, Tanya and Rimi, for helping us. So thank you all, and thank you to all of you, a very eminent audience. So it's a real pleasure and privilege to be presenting this research to you this morning. So the research question that set us up for this project is, have newly created Indian states in fact promoted inclusive development? And that stems from the interest in the creation of new states in India to remedy spatial inequality within the parent state and also promote inclusive development. So to address this question, we embarked upon a critical, comparative, political analysis of the two states, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and it is primarily qualitative research. I think it's well appreciated that the two states have much competitive potential. So they became states at the same time. They have high incidences of poverty, large numbers of tribal populations, very poor tribal populations, large forested tracts, considerable mineral wealth. Also, they have both experienced considerable extractive activity, mining, since the 1970s, and even earlier, in fact, and ostensibly contrasting records of social provisioning. So the question that's quite interesting and is often asked is, has Chhattisgarh in fact done better than Jharkhand? And if you look at some of the major figures here, in fact, it would seem to be the case. So if you look at growth, if you look at job growth, literacy rate, infant mortality, without laboring the point, Jharkhand has lagged behind. The story is perhaps not as simple when we look at the poverty rates. Both are still very poor. In fact, the 2005 to 2012 period, we find a very sort of similar kind of drop in poverty. In fact, Chhattisgarh is the poorest state in the country and has the highest poverty rate, and Jharkhand is one of the poorest states in the country. Perhaps what's interesting is that poverty reduction in Jharkhand was slower than in most states after 2005. And after a decade of no change, poverty in Chhattisgarh actually declined after 2005. So these are figures from the World Bank. Research from NIPFP shows us that public expenditure as a share of GSDP is higher in Chhattisgarh than in Jharkhand. And that has translated into significantly higher levels of per capita spending in Chhattisgarh over Jharkhand. We also find that the quality of public spending has been better in Chhattisgarh. A reading of the budget heads, expenditure on development services, both as a share of GSDP and total expenditure, has been higher in Chhattisgarh. We have also some indication that programmatic outcomes in major social welfare programs have been better in Chhattisgarh. Expenditure management perhaps has been poorer in Jharkhand than Chhattisgarh. So data has been an issue here, but we are relying on secondary literature. But perhaps what Chhattisgarh is best known for has been its reform, its spectacularly successful reform, some would say, of the public distribution system, or the PDS. And the PDS in Jharkhand, on the other hand, has been plagued by problems, despite attempts to reform it. So we know from very good secondary work that leakages have been cut in Chhattisgarh, quite a high number, 82% as compared to only 48% in Jharkhand, and also at the level at which it matters, at the household level, there is certainly there are reports of vastly improved receipts of rations. So after hearing this, you might wonder, well, why should we then not just compare welfare, the two states for their welfare outcomes? Why look at mining at all? Why focus on mining with welfare? So of course, we have some good reasons for doing that. Both are extremely poor, but also what's important is that these are mineral-rich states, and mining is central to their political economies. And it contributes to around 10% of the GDP in both states, which is more than some very important mining countries even, and certainly much more than the rate for India. It's also not just about the royalties, it's also a very important constituent of subnational identity in both states, particularly Jharkhand. We know that the mining sector is rent thick. It presents very strong incentives for regional elites to seek greater control, and this is of course accelerated after state creation in the larger context of liberalization and privatization. And this is a very important point, therefore. The organization of power around mineral wealth is constitutive of the political settlement itself. It shapes very important things like the structure of rent seeking or the rise of particular economic elites, but also the nature of popular mobilization and reaction by the state against that, suppression of resistance. More on this in the second panel. And very importantly, it raises significant questions of dispossessions and justice. The impacts of mining are very harsh for the poor, the environmental transformations, the livelihoods losses, these broader dispossessions. And these, in fact, provoke resistance. So therefore, we argue that a focus on accumulation strategies by the state via extraction must be read alongside investment in social provisioning. And we argue emphatically that inclusive development is more than improved service delivery, and inclusion with respect to mining and resource use is indeed critical. The research has also thrown us a very interesting question. How do states in fact deal with the social costs of mining, with these dispossessions, either through direct ways of responding, through direct ways of including people within mining, or indirect means, through the broader legitimating welfare agendas, and that's where PDS comes in. The conceptual approach that we've adopted to do this research is the political settlements approach. What does this mean? Essentially, a political settlement refers to the balance or distribution of power between contending social groups and social classes on which any state is based. And in fact, this is arrived at through a process of elite bargaining over time, and in fact underpins the basis of institutions and how they work. So as Khan has said, institutional arrangements, in order to be viable, must be compatible with the distribution of power in society, otherwise they will not exist, they will not stand the test of time, they will simply be challenged. So in essence, the political settlements framework focuses on the deeper forms of politics and power relations that underpin institutional performance and goes beyond the dominant hegemonic new institutionalist thinking in development. Mehta and Walton have also elaborated that the political settlement characterizes the political arrangements between the various socioeconomic groups in society, so not just between elites, but also between elites and subordinate groups. That's very important. Also,
the political settlement does not mean the absence of conflict. On the other hand, a successful political settlement means the management of distributive conflicts. It's very important for understanding state capacity. The political settlement allows state capacity to be deployed. What does that mean? So in theory, you can have high levels of bureaucratic capacity, but simply that is not deployed or not allowed to act because the arrangements amongst elites do not tap into that. So the literature on political settlement says that if you have, so elite cohesion matters. So if there is greater cohesion, longer stays in power, then state agencies are politically insulated, and that allows state capacity to be put to use. In the literature, there's discussion on how to typify settlements. I'll be very quick here. They can either be typified according to whether they are politically competitive or there's a dominant political grouping, and also the extent to which arrangements, transactions are based on personalized relations as opposed to formal rules. So on this basis, you can have dominant settlements, dominant party settlements, or competitive clientelist settlements. So Kunal will perhaps say a little bit more about this later. Needless to add, India is a competitive clientelist settlement. And that's intuitively clear. It's because all of India falls within the politically competitive group. And of course, there are functional capitalist institutions with well laid out rules, but those coexist with a wide range of informal rent sharing arrangements. And that's what makes it a competitive clientelist settlement. But if all of India is a competitive clientelist settlement, we argue we need more specific criteria to distinguish between states at the subnational level. A very important conceptual point also is that we posit that each state has a distinctive subnational political settlement that interacts uniquely with the national political settlement. We do not think of it as a national political settlement made up of 29 different micro-settlements. We think there are some clear advantages for using the political settlements approach. They help us go beyond traditional resource curse type arguments. They help us go beyond a focus on regime types and classifying state development interventions. They also help us go beyond a focus only on political agency or political will. But most importantly, I would argue it allows us a single analytical approach to undertake an integrated study of extraction with welfare, and that we argue goes beyond other existing works on extraction or welfare outside the resource curse framework. You might say that all politics is the study of power, but the political settlements approach gives us a systematic framework to appreciate the organization of power. Again, the literature distinguishes two dimensions by which power is organized: the horizontal dimension and the vertical dimension. The horizontal dimension depends on the degree of elite cohesion, dominant versus competitive, the relative ease by which the ruling coalition can be actually removed through the electoral process or not. The vertical dimension is the multi-class versus elitist dichotomy and refers to the degree of subordinate power in a settlement. To what extent can subordinate groups actually challenge ruling elites? Or to what extent do ruling elites actually need to worry about what subordinate groups are doing or saying? Again, needless to add, India is a competitive multi-class settlement. But once again, we need to distinguish at the subnational level, and that's where we would like to offer our analytical approach. And before I do that, I'd just like to reiterate, we're not using the political settlements framework as an explanatory black box. We're using it as a very sort of dynamic framework of different dimensions that respond to even exogenous factors. And we'd also like to clarify that while appreciating political settlements, we are also very concerned with cognitive maps or ideas and how they actually matter and interact with the settlement itself. This is my attempt at a diagram. It's not very good, but hopefully it will show us what the four dimensions are in the blue boxes right at top. So the first one refers to that horizontal dimension I talked about, political elite cohesion and incorporation into party politics. The second is bureaucratic autonomy, which we've included as a dimension specifically to distinguish between different categories of competitive clientelism. The third refers to relationships between political and economic elites. Okay, so it's not just the cohesion of political elites, but also how they relate to economic elites. It's sufficiently important to be a dimension in its own right. And the final dimension in our framework is what I refer to as the vertical dimension. Precisely the subordinate groups, their resistance, but not just that, also the state lashing back against that, the management of resistance. The four together bring in the subnational political settlement that interacts with exogenous factors, particularly like the role of the central government, that draws upon what we describe as underlying state capacity, which has everything to do with history and the legacy of the parent state, that further interacts with particular features of mining, of welfare, in this case the PDS, and the rest of our research shows how these produce particular outcomes that the second panel will talk about. State capitalism, whether it's weak or strong, welfare coalitions, whether they are weak or strong. I'm not going to talk about that right now because that's the remit of the second panel. A quick word about the historical underpinnings of the two states when they became new states. So we know that in Jharkhand, there was a dilution of radicalism of key Jharkhandi Adivasi political parties. There were multiple factions of tribal elites vying for power. And all of these were pitted against a national party like the BJP, a party with considerable resources. Chhattisgarh was very different. It inherited a neat structure of bi-party political competition, BJP Congress. What's important in Chhattisgarh is that there is a very large OBC group, and upper caste elites from both parties are very interested in appeasing the OBC vote, and they are primarily in the electorally important plains regions of Chhattisgarh, the central plains regions. There are no tribal political parties in Chhattisgarh, and that's linked with the absence of broader tribal political mobilization for statehood. So those are the two differences, the differences in the two states at the time of statehood. We said cognitive maps matter. What do we mean? Cognitive maps, as Mehta and Walton very eloquently put it, are ideas or underlying interpretation of how the world works. So these are not actually realized policy choices, but these are discursive possibilities for actions. These are ideas that are entertained. And I'd just like to point out that despite their very different historical underpinnings, actually at the time they became new states, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh did in fact espouse very similar commitments to modernization and industrialization, drawing on their abundant mineral wealth. So the dominant cognitive maps were very similar. But this produced, if you might call it, quite a lot of existential angst and the question of, well, whose state is it? And this gripped a lot of people, it alienated a lot of people. But the expression of resistance, of course, was structured differently, as we'll argue. Underlying state capacity refers to simply the capacity of the government, how it works, staffing, monitoring, accountability mechanism, all those very important nuts and bolts, which we argue are very strongly shaped by the legacy of the parent state, because we know that Chhattisgarh has inherited a much stronger legacy of institutional capacity than Jharkhand. So I'm just going to say that and move on, but I think the point is clear. And now in the remaining few minutes, I'd like to just briefly run through these four dimensions and how they're different in the two states. So the first is elite cohesion and incorporation into political parties. So following on from the historical legacy, Jharkhand has what we describe as low elite cohesion amongst political elites, multiple regional parties, a diffused Adivasi vote, no dominant political leader. Chhattisgarh, very different, high elite cohesion and political competition, restricted to the two main national parties, an appeasement of the dominant OBC vote, marginal political interest in Adivasi representation, and a dominant political leader in power for the third term. Bureaucratic autonomy relates to the organizational structure of rent seeking, and it means the space that is available to bureaucrats to act autonomously of demands made by politicians, presumably in order to pursue developmental goals at the bidding of the political leadership. So again, differences there. Chhattisgarh, we find much clearer organizational control by a popular dominant leader over a ruling party enjoying a stable term in power. And we argue that this has been matched by very centralized mechanisms of rent collection and well-institutionalized systems of distribution through the government and party structures. We'll talk about this more in the second panel. And with the top leadership controlling rents, effectively, it's able to insulate a coterie of elite bureaucrats from the daily demands by other lower-level politicians. So that's very important. Jharkhand is a very different situation. We know that there has been no stable ruling party, lots of very unstable coalitions forged for very instrumental reasons, rent collection and distribution much more chaotic and multi-layered, and the result is bureaucratic performance becomes constrained by short-term rent seeking, and the bureaucracy, broadly speaking, lacks autonomy in the sense of this broader insulation. Bureaucratic culture also reflects that. Chhattisgarh's elite bureaucrats even at the time of statehood, were well united under the new chief secretary and served the new CM, who himself had considerable administrative experience, and the trend has continued. Jharkhand, on the other hand, inherited a factionalized bureaucracy. It profited from absence of the active governing experience of the new political class. In fact, as our informants told us, teaching them how to be corrupt and how to use the procedures of government in order to make money. This is coming from very many informants. The third dimension, as I said, is the relationship between political and economic elites. Now, this is really the proper terrain of the extraction piece, but I'll just briefly say that Jharkhand's mining economic history, as we know, has been dominated by India's predominant private sector company, the Tatas, of course. And Jharkhand later experienced entry of various numerous private entrants, given the broader shifts in India at large. Chhattisgarh's mining economic history dominated by public sector units, so things like Bhilai. Here also we find new private economic actors have come in, but what's very important here is the conspicuous focus on thermal power production, which unleashed a lot of this interest from outside. There are significant differences in the extent of personalization of relationships and institutionalization of state mechanisms to respond to industry. Okay, so that's something we pick up on later. And finally, but not the least important, of course, is the issue of resistance. And for analytical ease, we divide it into two types: the violent resistance put out by Maoist groups. And here we find a broad difference in the expression and containment strategies. So in Jharkhand, there are more dispersed acts, whereas in Chhattisgarh, it's more concentrated in the southern districts. There has been a firm central government response in both, but Chhattisgarh has had, as we all know, a very high-profile state-sponsored vigilante army, or the Salva Jurung. Maoists have resisted mining activities very broadly, but there is also complicity with contractors and corporates. So that makes it quite difficult to study and assess exactly where they are situated. Very interesting differences in the nature of their two civil societies. The peaceful resistance networks, which we attribute to their very different histories of statehood. So in Jharkhand, there's been a strong tradition of resistance, linked perhaps with disappointment that many felt with the kind of shape that party politics was assuming at the time of statehood. The involvement of Christian activists and Jesuit priests has been very important. We know that there are a lot of activists in Jharkhand who serve as sort of mobile vanguards of people's movements. Not necessarily very well organized, but they're there. Chhattisgarh, again, a broad sweeping comparison, no comparable social movement legacy. And in fact, state crackdowns have taken place regularly on the main sources of civil society action since the 1990s. And here we also like to relate something to the political settlement. We find that there is a difference in the plurality of political culture and strict party lines. In Jharkhand, palpably more open involvement of local political representatives in supporting activities of resistance. Whereas in Chhattisgarh, that was not so. It was relatively more muted. I think it's important to establish that fears over being labeled as a Maoist exist amongst activists in both states, not just in Chhattisgarh, where there has been much of this, but also in Jharkhand. So, just to conclude, it is these dimensions that we are interested in. We are interested in their mutual relationships, how they react to particular exogenous factors, interact with state capacity, and particular domain features of mining and PDS in order to produce two broad sets of outcomes. The first is state capitalism. So without giving much away of the argument, I'll just say that we characterize Chhattisgarh as a relatively strong state capitalism, but that also includes fairly harsh treatment of protesters. Jharkhand is relatively weak, where it's harder to dismiss protesters. Very importantly, neither political settlement has fostered broader transformations to foster inclusion within mining. That's very important. Welfare coalitions in Chhattisgarh, our analysis shows that there is a welfare coalition in place, there is improved service delivery, and there is what we like to describe as managed rent seeking. In Jharkhand, there is an absence of such a coalition. There are major problems with service delivery, and there is fairly pervasive rent seeking. So this is where I'd like to stop, and the questions for panel 2 would be to also appreciate and understand how these two domains actually impact upon one another, and what are their implications for the management of these social costs, these dispossessions from mining. What does it mean for the legitimacy of the ruling coalition, and above all, what does that mean for inclusive development? Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Swastika, for a very clear presentation. We'll just turn right away to the panel, and Luis. Okay.
There it is. Thank you so much. Just let me start by thanking Vasudha for inviting me to comment on this panel this morning. It's very exciting for me to see this project because in many ways it picks up threads of stories that I began to tell in my earlier work on the political history of state bifurcation, which more recently I followed up by looking at the trajectories of Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh in comparison and asking some very similar questions to this paper on the impact of bifurcation on development. So very much appreciated and you know, a great piece of work. I was asked to comment on the utility of a subnational political settlements framework for understanding the politics of welfare in India, but also to look specifically at its relevance for Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. So I'll try to do both of those things. I think on the overall idea of trying to look at political settlements at the subnational level, I wanted to know a bit more about the aims of doing so, and whether the suggestion is that states exist within a broad continuum of what is described as competitive clientelism at the all India, the national level, or whether some states in fact exhibit tendencies that aren't very well captured by that national level description. And I think of Jharkhand in particular. I found it quite difficult actually to think of Jharkhand as having a stable political settlement. Certainly if one assumes that a political settlement is premised upon stability and growth which is consistent with stability, Jharkhand, as you've shown us quite nicely, has been extremely unstable since its creation. We've had, you know, a process of slightly clearer government formation in the last year, although I note in the newspapers this morning there's an ongoing controversy about the formation of the cabinet there. So I think, you know, the days of instability are not yet over in Jharkhand. So I would like to know a bit more about why the political settlement framework helps us at the subnational level, and whether in fact Jharkhand might lead us to open up the categorization of India as competitive clientelist at the national level. I also, you know, very much welcomed the clarity that's offered by the framework in the paper in isolating the kind of key vectors, if you like, that one might use to think about categorizing the political economy of states in India, and I think that's very useful. So you highlight these four factors of elite cohesion, of bureaucratic functioning, of state business relationships, and resistance to management resistance. And I think that helps you to really look comprehensively at a picture of the political economy at the subnational level. That said, I think that's maybe because you're trying to deal with rather different outcomes in this paper, both mining and the nature of capitalism, as well as welfare outcomes. It was sometimes unclear which parts of that framework were being prioritised to explain which kinds of outcomes. So it does offer a simple, clear framework that drives very rich description of subnational political economy. But it would be nice to dwell a bit more on the causal mechanisms that then work within that framework if one is seeking to explain particular outcomes. In terms of how it might enrich our understanding of the subnational politics of development, there are a few things that struck me, and I think these come out repeatedly in broader thinking and discussions about the politics of welfare in Indian states. One is the dependence on heavily centralised political leadership and administration. And we know very clearly from other states as well, Orissa, Bihar, Tamil Nadu, that chief ministers who see the virtue of implementing welfare schemes as modes of attaining political legitimacy take very close personal involvement in managing those programs. And
that should prompt us to think about the kind of capacity and accountability that's been produced as a result. It may allow gains in the delivery of certain kinds of social welfare programs. PDS, of course, has been recently an area which chief ministers have seen reasonably a reasonable amount of traction in terms of achieving some good electoral credit from welfare reforms. But what do they mean for those kind of harder to achieve areas of social policy, for education, for health, and so on, that require slightly longer term visions? The other aspect that I just wanted to highlight and dwell a little bit on in the context of these states is that question of state capacity and administrative capacity. You, in the presentation and at several points in the paper, refer to it as almost an underlying factor that is an inheritance for these states from their parent states. And that suggests almost that it exists prior to the question that you're asking, that one can look at states and read off from them the level of administrative capacity. And there's some really fantastic stuff in the paper on bureaucratic transfers, on vacancies, on tax effort and so on, which is very welcome. But I wonder whether you don't give quite enough credence here to the role of political agency or political leadership, particularly in explaining change, why outcomes may change in a state. This has come out very starkly for me when looking at the divergent trajectories of Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh. So by looking at the experience of a new state and its parent state, one might assume that one's taking certain things for granted in terms of their political settlements, which look reasonably similar at the point of bifurcation. And in making that kind of comparison, the role of political leaders, in particular the role of Raman Singh in Chhattisgarh compared to Shivraj Singh Chauhan in Madhya Pradesh, have produced very different kinds of social coalitions that have led different kinds of distributive politics in both states. So I wonder whether the approaches of political leaders needs to be incorporated a little more centrally into the political settlement framework, at least as part of an explanation for where change comes from. And since we're interested in change, that seems pretty important. One final remark, and this may stray into the territory of the next panel, is the relationship between the extractive sector and welfare programs in both states. And I think you're making a useful observation here in the rather indirect nature of redistribution that takes place in both states. That fiscal space that is opened up by mining in Chhattisgarh, more than in Jharkhand, is being used to finance expansive social provision. But much of that social provision is aimed not at mining areas, but at the core electoral base of the BJP in the state, which is in the plains areas of Chhattisgarh, not the tribally dominated, resource-rich parts of the state. So that indirect nature of the kind of payoff from mining, I think, is worth bearing in mind. I also thought it would be very interesting and quite hard to do within the paper, but to interrogate the way that the PDS has operated in Buster, in particular, in Maoist held areas, where it seems that there is an implicit understanding between government and Maoists over the operation of the PDS. So one could argue there that the PDS itself is aiming a form of state formation Maoist-held areas, which seems also to be an important part of the political settlement, if you like, in Chhattisgarh. So I think I'll leave it there. I've probably already tested the patience of the chair, but thank you very much again for this very rich set of work.
Thank you, Louise. And as you can imagine, with Kunal, Louise, and Ratin, you'll have a treat of kind of discussion on federalism more broadly from different angles. Ratin?
Thank you, and thank you to Vasudha and your team for inviting me. This is taking me back to my early days as an academic. I did work, as you know, on political settlements long time ago, and coming back to it 15 years is very interesting. Let me make some non-political settlement points first about your paper, which may be helpful. The analytical construct that states are more dependent of the center when their own tax revenues are relatively lower than total tax revenues is incorrect, because the divisible pool of taxes does not belong to either party. Uh, that brings in an interesting question in respect of legacy. The divisible pool of taxes, once the vertical devolution between the centre and all states is decided, is then quinquennially altered by a constitutional body, as you know, called the Finance Commission. And in the Finance Commission formulae, over the last 15 years, and certainly 2 Finance Commissions post the creation of these new states, the emphasis has been increasingly on the inverse of per capita income. So, when Jharkhand was part of Bihar, Bihar gets the second largest share in the divisible pool after UP, principally because after population and area, it is the poorest state. That was no longer the case with Jharkhand. So, to an extent, I think it will be worth exploring the extent to which Jharkhand lost out qua Bihar in terms of its share of the divisible pool. The second sort of technical point is something obvious but important to remember in both states. The gross state domestic product, by which you measure per capita state income or whatever, is measured in India using value added. Theoretically, when you do it in a country, it should exactly equal gross state domestic product measured by expenditure, right? So what you value add, you spend, plus savings. That is not true at the sub-state level. So it is well known by now that the GSDP for Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, when you look at expenditure, are grossly overestimated, because the value added from mining is increasing, is to a large extent moves outside the state, to the extent it is not payments to wages, etc., suppliers directly in these states. Exactly the opposite problem is Kerala, where the GSDP is underestimated because of remittances, which increase expenditure. That has a fiscal implication, because your tax base, and therefore when you make judgments about tax effort, principally in a state depends on, because state taxes, own tax revenues are principally consumption taxes. So the extent to which you look at GSDP as part of the tax base needs to be modified when you look at consumption expenditure. Now luckily, that should be true in the case of both Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh. It would be interesting to get someone to look at the extent to which this had a differential impact in both states. I suspect that intuitively the Jharkhand would suffer far more from this than Chhattisgarh would. But that's just intuitive, I don't know. The third point I wanted to make was in terms of, again, the fiscal. To what extent have these states both benefited from and used centrally sponsored schemes? You haven't mentioned that in the papers I read, and that would be interesting to look at, because that is another important flow which technically belongs to the center, but in effect is spent by the states. And the whole discussion on state capacity has assumed relevance here, because what you had was a non-trivial increase in the amounts of resources that states were supposed to deliver, essentially to, whether it's Narega or SSA or Innovation, to social services. We've discussed this before. I know this is very difficult to do, but in terms of further research, I think it would be interesting to look at what I would call CSS capacity. Now I'm going to slowly transit to political settlements. But the fourth point I want to make in this context is that the fact that states cannot fill posts, which you mentioned repeatedly in the paper, need not be automatically a reflection of either poor state capacity or poor public spending. What it does do is it blocks money as committed expenditure. But then you see bureaucracies know that. A good example is Orissa, where posts were unfilled, shockingly unfilled for a long time. And when I made inquiries about 5 years back with the Orissa government, I found this was intentional. The argument given to me was that if you can guarantee me that right or wrong, the argument given to me was if you can guarantee that if I hire more teachers in the public service, I will improve my education outcomes and I will spend more. But if you can't give me that guarantee, then shut up. So it was a very well thought out, calibrated choice by the state government for a long time. If that is the case, then you see working back bureaucrats know this money is not going to be spent. And then there is the possibility for them to spend money in other areas if they have capacity to spend it. So it would be worth sort of again going back and interrogating the bureaucrats whether this was, I don't know. I know in Orissa and I know in Maharashtra, but I don't know whether in either state it was deliberate policy not to fill posts. Because if it was, then to conclude that money is either locked up or a function of state capacity would potentially be erroneous. So it's worth a follow-up. Transiting now slowly to political settlements. When we talk, interesting fact you mentioned there that in Chhattisgarh, legacy was the mining was PSU driven, and in Jharkhand there was one big private sector player. It was Tata, and to a large extent, the conversation about mining, particularly when we are trying our best to attain a growth rate, an absurdly high growth rate, becomes one where we talk about it as an overriding national priority in the context of Make in India, improving manufacturing, whatever. So I'm not sure, and one thing the paper could perhaps bring out a little more, how the conversations about this sector that happened at the Government of India level, at the grand national level, either constrained or complemented the conversations happening with states. That seemed to be missing. Perhaps I didn't pick it up. But that would be an interesting way to enrich the discussion you have, because we found this interesting stylized fact that Chhattisgarh was PSUs and Jharkhand had the Tatas. Chhattisgarh did not have the Tatas. So the Tatas clearly have a national conversation with the Prime Minister, and the PSUs have a national conversation with the Prime Minister. So how do those conversations interact with the state level conversations that you discuss? Okay. Political settlements. Now, as Vasudha knows, on the fiscal side, I did my PhD partly on this. One of the things that you bring out with political settlements is that they require in greater or lesser measure what I have called, other people have called, Mushtaq has called, Mushtaq Khan, you quote, stability payments. Now, stability payments are payments that are made because, in that theoretical framework, because the right to raise revenues, either through tax or non-tax revenue, generates a concomitant set of obligations on the part of the state, which can be strongly or weakly defendable rights on part of those whom the state allegedly serves, right? And when there is something wrong with this, either on the revenue side or on the spending side, then stability payments are necessary. Therefore, if your principal conclusion is true, which is that the expected outcomes from mining in terms of improvements in the quality of welfare in the social sector did not arise, then that itself, in that framework, would generate stability payments. Not necessarily to those who are deprived, but perhaps to someone else. So I would be very curious. I know this is not the thrust of your research, but since I'm a fiscal guy, I'd be very curious to know what these stability payments were and whether fiscally it would be possible to identify them. Now, keeping to stability payments, in that theoretical framework, there are two separate analytical inquiries one makes with stability payments within a political settlement. Having defined a political settlement as you have, I'm not going into it, that's panel 2, I guess, or somebody else. There is the level of stability payments, and that has fiscal implications, and I'll give you an example in 10 seconds. And there is its effectiveness. So the two are different. So you can have high-level ineffective stability payments, you can have low-level effective stability payments. In the case of the Government of India, for example, I'm reviewing this FRBM, it is very clear that the stability payments the Government of India is making on account of paramilitary expenditure, which has gone up by 300% in the last 25 years, principally because of Jharkhand, Kashmir, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, means that it is becoming facile now to talk about a revenue deficit that is zero. Because if you take that as exogenous, then these are stability payments that are being made, and the Home Ministry is the only ministry whose expenditure has gone up in real terms the last 15 years. It's gone up by 32%, mainly on personnel. So that immediately has a fiscal cost. And that's a stability payment that is a level problem. Now, we know that, well, we can speculate whether that stability payment is effective or not. I would tend to say it's not very effective. That's a separate line of inquiry. So again, to sort of think about it in this fashion would be interesting. And again, both with level and stability, there are two separate analytical inquiries. One is who were the recipients of these stability payments, and then what were the outcomes. Within the political settlement discourse, this is a question. As far as I understand it, the theoretical framework that I was, maybe it's moved on, that I was working in, talked about actors who are willing to work within the framework of the stability of the political settlement and not challenge it. Where do Maoists fit in here? Are they challenging the political settlement? Are they eliding with it? Are they doing both? Is that itself a transformative force? I know nothing about it. So I'm just throwing that up as a question, because in an orthodox fashion, you would say with significant Maoism and persistent failure of the use of coercive power and the absence of any other solution moving towards a political settlement, what you see in both these states is an inherited and incipient failed political settlement. But you're not using that word. You're talking about challenges, etc. So I'd like to know a little more about how that works. My final point is about bureaucracy and civil society. The it would be interesting to look at the structure of the bureaucracy. The only bureaucracy that had a choice, largely speaking, as to where they were deployed was the IAS, and to a limited extent the state civil service. Moment you move to departmental bureaucracies, they were more or less assigned the areas and places where they came from, right, outside the capital, BDOs, blah 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 blah. They were not.
Not for the IAS.
No, not the IAS. I'm saying except the IAS and the SCS. The bulk of the bureaucracy is limited transferable. So, for example, I don't know about Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, but more recently, because I was involved with it, in Telangana and Andhra, it was only 15% of the bureaucracy that was really affected. The rest of them there was an ethnic origin, formula even for Hyderabad. So, that inheritance, was it different in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand? I don't know, I'm just curious. That may be another line of inquiry to sort of drill deep into what exactly happened in terms of bureaucratic legacies. Trouble is, because we speak in English, we talk to IAS officers and at the most SCS officers. But if you drill down deeper and you talk to BDOs, talk to agricultural extension officers, talk to Department of Education cadre, talk to Mantralaya, the finance cadre, that's a very interesting cadre, because that moves seamlessly but is district limited at the very bottom. And finally, I'd like to understand what civil society is here. I don't think we're including the Maoists in civil society, so there would be a sort of civil society which would interact with three players. One would be the Maoists who actually posit an alternative state, I assume, otherwise they wouldn't be violent. And then there would be the state, which is in conflict then, and somewhere there would be civil society. So is the interaction of civil society, other than the fact that it's more limited in Chhattisgarh than in Jharkhand, different in both states with respect to how they interact with these two other disruptive players? Is my final sort of complete non-economist question. Perhaps it's a straight answer, I don't know it. Thank you.
So what I'm going to speak about is not so much about India per se, but mostly about the research program that we are a part of, Vasudha's project, and what I'm also been involved in. So it's part of a wider program on the politics of inclusive development, which is undertaken by Effective State Inclusive Development the Research Center. It's based in Manchester. I'm one of the research directors, along with Sam Hickey, and it's funded by DFID. Now, we have now come to the end of our program, the first phase, which is about roughly for 5 years. So we worked in 12 countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, across domains of accumulation, economic growth, natural resources, redistribution, health, education, social protection, in mainly, but also other domains of distribution, and recognition, we include women's empowerment and spatial inequality. Using a common approach, we call the political settlements plus approach. Now, why do we call it the political settlements plus approach? Because if you look at the kind of classic political settlements approach, it's really Mushtaq Khan's contribution. It's mostly a rational actor approach, very much based on more understanding of how power is generated through rational actor means. And what we try to do in that, we kind of, if you wish, graft it in an understanding of role of ideas and cognitive maths elites into that approach. And I think that's a much more powerful way of understanding how we see different outcomes in development across countries. So we call it the political settlements plus approach. And we already have now, using a comparative case study approach, about 60 case studies in different domains and countries, so 60 observations, which kind of provides a fertile ground for comparative inference. I wanted to just say that political settlements theory is not really a theory that can actually be seen as similar to Asmund Robinson's theory of long-run development, or the work by Kathleen Thelen, James Mahoney. We don't really see it like that. We see it as a mid-range theory that's somewhere between the macro theories of long-run development and the more micro-oriented approaches that look at political agency and individual actors' behavior. So we see somewhere in between that. And so in a sense, I think it's much more helpful to understand political settlements theory as something that sort of explains variations among similar states in terms of their broad overall level of development progress. It's exactly the Chhattisgarh-Jharkhand comparison makes sense. It really is when we look at those similar kinds of endowments, similar kinds of state level formation, and then try to understand why we see variation in outcomes within a particular time frame. I think that's the way we think of political settlements theory. So I think we should not see PS theory as something that's sort of a very new thing that's not really been done for political science literature. I think that's not really the way we think about it. And I think that's also important because it also explains why we can see variations in outcomes within sort of medium-term time frames. So we might imagine that there may be long-run determinants of development that are really can be explained by various historical reasons. But when we see developed outcomes that are happening in the 5 to 10 year terms, especially in the way we're looking at it in Jharkhand, I think we can make sense that we can see that political settlements theory can actually make a lot of sense in that kind of time frame. So what have we found so far in our work? So what we found is that certainly the message that we get from our work, and that sort of comes from even from Musaq's work itself, is that really to understand how institutions function, we need to understand deeper forms of politics and power relations. Not just in terms of growth, which is originally what Mustaq was looking at, but in terms of accelerating human development, gender equity across the whole domains that we looked at in our work. And also the other thing that's important that we found in our work, that the underlying forms of politics and power have different institutional effects and outcomes in different kinds of political settlements. Now, in this case, in the Indian case, it's very much within competitive clientelar settlements, but we looked at dominant party settlements versus competitive clientelar settlements, and we get very different kinds of stories. We look at different kinds of political settlements. So one thing that I think the thing that's really important in the kind of work we've done is the centrality of power relations. Who holds power? Which sorts of elites hold power? How do they deploy power? Who challenges power? It's really important understanding why we see developed outcomes in different kinds of domains in accumulation, recognition, and redistribution. Understanding power and power relations and the ways deployed is essential in the political settlements approach, and I think that comes very clearly from our work. And the other thing that's interesting in our kind of work, the work we've done, is that within the two broad categories of political settlements, dominant party and competitive clientelists, two very separate trajectories for development outcomes, successful development outcomes. So if you look at trajectory one, which is essentially dominant ruling party coalition, dominant party settlement, the classic case is Rwanda in our case studies, but also to some extent Uganda in the early stage, and possibly if you think about earlier historical examples, South Korea, we see a dominant ruling coalition with elite vision for development that is essentially making sure that you have outcomes in development, outcomes in many different domains, growth, education, so on. And that's one kind of trajectory. The second trajectory we see is where we see within competitive clientelar settlements, we see some tendencies which are actually problematic, which are essentially coming from the fact that we have very short-term vision of elite vision in this kind of settlements. We see politicization of the public bureaucracy in the settlements, which are working against any possible positive development outcomes. But often in that, we see ideological commitment ruling parties to specific policy goals and presence of strong and coherent coalitions around particular policy domains. That comes on very clearly in the work we're going to talk about in Chhattisgarh PDS reform. So essentially, the examples we have here, apart from the examples from the project we're talking about here, is also Bangladesh in education in Ghana, for example, social protection in many different competitive clientelar settlements. So that's also interesting that we can see these two very different trajectories and very different settlements, and the point is to learn from this kind of examples that we see by other countries. So I think the point for India is that for India we see common tendencies in competitive clientelar settlements, which is where India is not unique in its seeming dysfunctionality of its public bureaucracy in delivering effective public goods, and a lack of long-term vision for growth and development. So this tells us that if you're working on India and understanding the work on India across different states, you've got to understand why is it that Indians' behavior in India across the different states is not really different from what you see in many other countries with competitive clientelar settlements, and you've got to learn from those kind of examples too. Finally, when you look at policy implications of what we found, we also find that development interventions had to be very clearly attuned to particular kinds of politics and governance contexts. So essentially trying to think through best practice approaches, particularly in competitive clientelar settlements such as in India, is not a very good idea. So for example, in our work, what we are often finding is that you need to spend time in understanding context, you need to seek out good fit institutional responses to specific problems, and you need to take effort to actually identify good fit as an initial bet, and then try to think of that as a way to start thinking of policy reform rather than a blueprint. And then work with the grain in trying to understand institutional change. This comes out very clearly from the work we see in PDS reform in Chhattisgarh, and it tells us a little bit about how in India we often think about large-scale ambitious reforms which often don't work. And I think that tells us exactly why large-scale ambitious reforms are trying to change the way things work will often not succeed if you don't think through the political context and the way certain things actually happen in terms of the governance context. So I think that's a message that I think it comes out very clearly from not just from India's our work in India, but other country contexts.
Thanks, Kunal. I guess I'll just make a couple of points. I mean, there's a lot to discuss in this paper, and the paper covers such a kind of vast terrain. I think encapsulated by the sort of four broad thematic heads, from state capacity to political coalitions. I just want to focus my remarks on sort of the underlying conceptual framework around political settlement, and one way to perhaps redeploy your own data, as it were. I think it's not sort of taking issue with anything you're saying, but just trying to perhaps bring it into greater focus. So the first, I think, issue I want to begin with, if you look at the original political settlements literature, right, the central analytical point was supposed to be that political settlement involves two different kinds of claims. It involves a claim about the form through which the state governs, right? And it involves, it involves a claim about which social groups are included. So what we mean by the form through which the state governs, if you remember in Mushtaq's original formulation, the contrast was supposed to be between developed and developing countries, where the form through which political settlements endure in developed countries are actually formal legal rules, right? So the political settlement is around a capitalist order, formal property rights, a whole range of legal protections, which can have radical inequalities within it, but the point about it was that it was essentially formal, right? Whereas in a sense, the challenge for developing countries was that your political settlements, the form through which it operated, was substantially informal, right? And the development transition was supposed to be, how do you actually get the trajectory from these informal political settlements to some kind of formal political order, right? Where you at least know in a sense what the order is, where it's rules based, whatever those in a sense rules might be, right? And to the extent that, and this is in a sense, right, a question which is, by all accounts, one thing that both Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh still have in common, right, despite the differences, is that you don't see that transition path from the informal to the formal at all, right? In fact, in some senses, it might actually be exacerbated, right? So that's one kind of thing to think about, because when you think of, and particularly because you're also trying to link the discussion of social classes to the discussion of state capacity, which are all in the formal domain. All your data is the formal domain data, right? Welfare schemes and so forth. You do talk about these underlying informal sort of stories, but I think you could do more with that by basically, in a sense, making that argument that, to put it provocatively, you don't see evidence that India is on that pathway if you actually array it from the informal to the formal story, right? So that's one big macro story. The second element of that political settlement story was the who gets what. Who are the groups that are involved in this formal or informal sort of arrangement, right? And there you tell a pretty convincing story about the different classes, state-business relationships, so on and so forth. I think the question that arises, I was just trying to, after reading your paper, trying to think of formal settlements across different Indian states historically, and maybe more also in the developing context, right? To be provocative, could one say the following, that the only conditions under which formal settlements are, not formal settlements, political settlements described in this way, are actually radically upset are, one, either a big exogenous shock, right? And it could be a positive shock as well, right? So if you ask the question, what distinguishes the political economy of Karnataka, or the states we think of as more kind of advanced on this development continuum, or Punjab even, there is some big exogenous economic factor, right? The rise of IT, green revolution, right? Something in a sense exogenous which actually unsettles that and then creates a new kind of disequilibrium, right? Around which then a new politics emerges. This is kind of old Albert Hirschman, uneven growth stuff, right? And essentially the problem with Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh is that you just don't have those kinds of positive shocks at all, right? So what you're looking at in the sense is variations within a margin, right? I mean, what is the development story in Jharkhand, right? I mean, you don't have a big engine of urbanization, which you don't in Chhattisgarh, which is typically the big disequilibrating story in almost all other Indian states, right? So that's one condition, or one seems to be one fairly common necessary condition across which. And the second one in which you can actually change coalitions is where you can do, what the Brazilians called distribution without redistribution, right? Again, often linked to an exogenous shock. Commodity prices go up and, suddenly the state gets more revenue, so you can actually roll out some cash transfers. It's amazing how short-lived that turned out to be in retrospect, right? And again, both Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh do not have that possibility of distribution within redistribution, right? So the only thing you will get by way of kind of altering the political settlement is actually more intense conflict around still a relatively static pie where there is no alternative development narrative, nor is there a sufficiently large, if you might say, fiscal windfall, exogenous, which can actually change that politics of distribution. And that could go one of two ways. One, it could go, which is the direction Ratin was indicating it, which is it could actually lead to the failure of the political settlement, right? And Jharkhand arguably is tending in that direction, and there I think perhaps doing more with the data on violence might actually be, allow you to get a handle on that question, to what extent is it a failed political settlement, because you can use violence as a proxy for saying neither the formal works nor the informal works, right? What you actually just have is outright coercion, and an outright coercion of a kind which is, not captured by the formal sort of mechanics of the of the law and order machinery in some ways, right? So, in other words, I think reading your papers made me feel very pessimistic. That I think, are we underestimating how rare actually the kind of broad development transformations that we all seem to want by way of outcomes actually are, and how the big driving forces of those outcomes, are often these exogenous shocks. There are very, very few cases you can think of, right? I mean, most states, when we think of a big transformation, you think of a government doing one scheme well or two schemes well, right? But almost all the other big development transformations, right, just do have this kind of larger conjunctural story behind them. And what happens to politics in states like Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh when you actually don't have that? Should we open it up? And then maybe at the end, or do you want to respond first, or maybe just, I think, since there's a large number of questions, maybe we'll just come back to, you can pick a couple that you might want to respond to. I think the audience has been patient, so we'll collect a few more comments briefly before we ask the presenters.
Thank you. That was truly interesting. I just have 2 points to raise. They are more in the nature of questions. One is that the whole notion of groups being incorporated into a political settlement depends upon the historical time at which these groups become politically significant enough to be incorporated. I mean, these are not settled. The status of a group, you look at the way the OBCs have come up as a very major politically significant group dating from the 1970s, that they have to be a part of any political settlement. So I suggest that the whole notion of how a group becomes historically important and how a group loses in importance is also a very important part of the political settlement literature, which by virtue of being institutional perhaps overlooks these preconditions for which group succeeds. And bring me to my second question. In all the 3 states that got independence in 2000, these were states which had very powerful social movements. Now, they were very different. Uttarakhand had a very powerful environmental movement. Jharkhand's movement was more in the nature of an identity struggle for dignity, but in Chhattisgarh we saw one of the most progressive political movements in the form of the Chhattisgarh Mukti Sangathan under Niyogi. The formation of all these three states in 2000 actually leads to the de-radicalization of these political movements. And how is it that the SC/ST communities, which form the backbone of the movement, at least in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, lose out? I mean, what is it that 100 years of political mobilization in the case of Jharkhand and about 20-25 years under Shankar Guha Niyogi is whipped away in the matter of, and completely new groups emerge to appropriate power and to appropriate the development agenda? How is it that the most disadvantaged? So these two questions, preconditions of the political settlement, you might wish to consider at least in a footnote, if not in the major. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. I'm Ravi Raman from Nagaru Memorial Museum and Library. I have a theoretical issue with the notion of what is called the nation or subnational sort of a thing that you are using in your paper. Because at the moment, the very usage of the term nation and subnational is highly problematic. And I would say that it is, it simply reifies the way in which the nation is understood by the contemporary government. So for instance, it is basically strengthens the notion of Hindu fundamentalism. So I would suggest that instead of using the term subnational, it's better to use, say, semi-autonomous state. I mean, by following the post-Westphalian notion of state. And many scholars in Germany, for instance, have used the term semi-autonomous state instead of using subnational. That is one thing that I would say. And the other thing is in connection with Pratap's comment, I mean, with a focus on exogenous, you know. So long as the institution that is highly, which is deterrent, I mean, as far as the subalterns are concerned, is the caste, I would say that the shock is something which is to come from within, not from outside. Because the kind of exogenous shock that you are talking about, the IT for instance, again is so exclusive as far as the subalterns are concerned, particularly with respect to IT in Bangalore for instance. It has always been exclusive for the subalterns and the marginalized. So the shock is something which is to come from within, not from outside.
We're talking about particular kinds of terror, but your point taken. Yeah, Niranjan.
It's actually a very simple question. One of the things that I think is very difficult to comprehend from something that looks at political settlements approach is what is the extent to which democratic politics can move countries onto separate development paths, right? I mean, so any kind of word like clientelism or settlement actually doesn't, in and of itself, give you space for democracy versus non-democracy. And what? So if I think of a state like Bihar, do we not believe that moving from Lalu to Nitish may have put the state on a different development path? And isn't that something that came through purely democratic means? Is there some huge external shock that created that? I may be too charged, right? But you know, so I guess the simple question is, what scope do you see, even if we can't see right now with the set of political actors that are in play or the set of parties that are in play, what scope do you see for democratic politics in sort of change on
Hi.
I'm Sabyasachi Kar from Ministry of Economic Growth. My comment is that when you are dealing with a subnational state, and especially in the political settlement context, I'm not sure, maybe I'm mistaken, but to me it seems that the national context is being ignored. The settlement is ensured not only by the elites of the state, but also by the central elite, who have a completely different set of interests. And so the outcomes in these two states would also depend significantly on what the central elites' interests are from each of them, what role they play in the central elites' program, so to speak, of development. And so theoretically, somewhere together with the elites' interest at the state level, the central elites' interest in each of these states, whether they are similar or different, needs to be taken into consideration. For example, these states might mean nothing more than just states from where minerals are extracted for the central elite, but it may not. They might have different objectives for each of the states. And so if they do ensure the settlements, they will extract something from that.
So my question, I guess, is kind of adding on to Nilanjan's. Sorry, I'm Vikram Srinivas. I work at the Accountability Initiative at CPR. I mean, you talk in Jharkhand when describing the political settlement that now it is moving towards a stronger leader, and there have been mentions in the paper as well as in the presentation about how now there's a strong chief minister and things can change. Just looking through the things, I wonder if the only kind of transformative thing is, if we talk about, is the emergence of the strong political leadership. Because in and of itself, it doesn't seem like bureaucratic capacity will autonomously increase, or that state-business relationship will autonomously change than what they are right now. So if the only thing which can change is basically the politics of Jharkhand in and of itself, so my question is, are we already seeing that? Is that your sense? I mean, you describe it as now part of the political, kind of a stable political settlement, that now you're seeing something. But my question is, has the politics of Jharkhand changed in such a way that it is now seeing emergence of something, or do you see something, it is some kind of aberration which will now disappear as well?
One last question. Just 2 points. One is that I think, it's I wouldn't make a sweeping statement about civil society in Chhattisgarh, because while it's true that the statehood came as a kind of buy two get one free model with Jharkhand and Uttaranchal, but the reality is that the aspiration for statehood was very well articulated in Chhattisgarh by the Chhattisgarh Mukti Morcha, Shankar Guhan, Yogi and others. So I don't think one can say that civil society didn't have a role. They may not have had at that point in time, but it was certainly articulated better. Second, just on facts, actually Ratin, the reverse is true of what you said, and Sailesh Pathak is here. He was in the thick of it as an IAS officer who moved from MP to Chhattisgarh. The IAS had no say, because that was done by a very formula, every third, every fifth, deeply flawed, which a mutual friend of ours who became the chief secretary later even litigated against. Lower bureaucracy had a choice. So it's the IAS, they did not have a choice. And if anything, we're deeply resentful of the move. It was seen as a banishment, कि बहुत बेआबरू होकर तेरे कूचे से हम निकले, kind of a
Did they actually move people from the Mantraya level, the district level, the division level? Because they're not normally transferred outside the division.
Right, so the situation in Chhattisgarh was very different from the situation in Jharkhand. Absolutely. Most Bihar cadre officers wanted to move to Jharkhand. Most Madhya Pradesh cadre officers did not want to move to Jharkhand.
I'm talking about non-IAS.
Right. Nuance there, Biraj. There was an option for people from the Madhya Pradesh cadre to shift to Chhattisgarh, and similarly in Jharkhand. So a lot more people exercise that option in Jharkhand. Beyond that, wherever, if you're from outside, you are assigned the lottery. If you're from within the state, as most of the non-IAS people are, you were assigned to where your home district and home address was, which is why this concept was non-existent for the non-IAS people, because most of them are from that state anyway. And as a postscript, after about 5 years of Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, most of the guys who wanted to shift from Bihar to Jharkhand and could not were very happy.
What I'll do is just invite Vasudha and team to just, you can't answer all of these questions, but just pick 2 or 3 that, you want to engage with. And we will have more opportunity in the next session to visit some of the questions.
Okay, so thanks very much. Some very provocative and very, very interesting remarks and questions, and that's really what we wanted. Can't answer everything, but I'll just pick up on a couple of points, which I think, I mean, again, not that I hope to provide answers, but I think these are important questions for discussion. So one question which we've toyed with is the issue of what is a failed political settlement. I think that comes up a couple of times as well. I think Louise talked about it. Made me sort of go back to some of the initial conversations we had when we initially, actually at one point did describe Jharkhand as an unstable political settlement. If you remember, Ratin, a year ago, that's how we described it. That Jharkhand has an unstable political settlement and Chhattisgarh has a stable political settlement. And the discussion in the room was along these lines that why do you call it an unstable political settlement? What you find is sort of unstable stays of governments in power or unstable regimes, but a settlement is more than a regime. And there is nothing that is, and this is the important point, I think, that there was nothing so substantively different in the offerings of different parties and coalitions. So, you know, even if there would be a transfer of power, the political settlement itself would not change, because that was reflecting a basic sort of underlying distribution of power and the aspirations of these various elites who were not necessarily reflecting what broader, very marginalized groups of tribal populations necessarily wanted. So I think there's a question about whether we are so clear about what makes a failed political settlement. And I think that one of the tricky things about this research, in fact any comparative research within India, is that it's very hard to sort of say this is this and this is this. I see this more as sort of points on a spectrum. I mean, there is functionality that coexists with dysfunctionality. So if you're calling Jharkhand a failed state, I don't think so. There is a lot of functionality there too, and people will tell you that, and we see that. So if it's dysfunctional in some ways, and that is explainable through these political settlement dimensions, and that's why I was emphasizing, perhaps overemphasizing, that we don't see it as an explanatory black box. We see it as a moving framework with different dimensions. Absolutely take your point, Louise, that the causal mechanisms weren't as well specified when that paper was first drafted, but we hope to have arrived at more clarity. We'll highlight that in the second panel. I think the issue of Bastar, and Nandini is here, so I'm really hoping she will enlighten us about that. Can you have a failed settlement within a larger settlement that actually works? I mean, this is, I think, Chhattisgarh, we were not able, with great regret I say, to really do field work in those spaces, given our time and given the risks, and simply weren't able to. So I don't have the kind of field data firsthand to be able to answer some of those questions. But the larger conceptual question, of course, is that can you have spaces of failed settlements? And the challenges for the state level elites is how then to manage that, how then to contain that even, and to not allow that to spill over. Do we see that Chhattisgarh is able to successfully at least contain it and not allow that to damage what it is doing at its core? I think so. So I think there is this larger issue of a failed political settlement, and I'm hesitant to say that either state has failed. Kunal, your point about exogenous shocks, very interesting, very enlightening, and very thought-provoking. I agree that neither state has seen this kind of big shift. I think perhaps the biggest shift really, I mean, in my understanding, is the sort of larger economic shift we see in India, the sort of story of liberalization, privatization, and those broader economic transformations, what has been described as the emergence of competition, states competing to attract capital. So those bigger shifts have been very much witnessed, and they are important. I think the statehood story, the very fact of becoming a state and what that did to the political elites who kind of rose to the occasion. So but there isn't a sort of a similar big exogenous shift that we see. So does that mean that there is no hope? Or are we tinkering at the margins? I think that's something to discuss. Another very thought-provoking point I found is that, okay, fine, so you're going to make a difference to a scheme like PDS, but how far can you actually go to taking on some of the larger, much more unattainable kinds of goals, really making a shift to poverty outcomes, to dent to health, those kinds of things. And I think that's why, I mean, one research project cannot do everything, but one thing that we then became much more interested in is that, of course, how are these claims about success reflecting in ideas of legitimacy? Because that, for me as a political scientist, became very interesting. So the dispossessions on the one hand, and the trying to seek legitimacy through these broad claims about welfare, even when the data is not always supporting that. So we do find that there is tremendous poverty in Chhattisgarh, We do find that not everything works in Chhattisgarh, but the fact that they can actually talk about a fairly well-functioning scheme is a very big deal for the ruling coalition. So that's why this idea of legitimacy came in, even though it was not in the original proposal, really. There was another comment about democratic politics and shaping development outcomes. I mean, I don't really know how to answer that question, because that's a very big question about how far, how far do we see democratic politics in challenging developmental outcomes. Perhaps one way to look at it is to ask ourselves, I mean, how do we define these development outcomes? Are we talking about development outcomes in terms of necessarily improvements in particular indices, or are we looking at development in a broader relational sense, where we see more questioning, more, I mean, that of course traditionally would mean that things may even get done slowly. You might actually see worsening development outcomes. So, but I think that's a bigger conversation. About about Jharkhand, how different are the last 2 years? I mean, I think that somebody here said that, is it just the fact that you have the BJP in power, but everything else still is the same and may take much longer to change? I would be sympathetic to that argument. But at the same time, I wouldn't underplay the importance of for the first time, the actual fact of majority government, the actual fact of the lack of an unstable coalition, the actual fact that bureaucrats are in post and feeling quite enthused about doing what they want to do. So we felt this palpably. We did interviews in Jharkhand in November 2014, right before the election, even in the months before the elections, and people were very unenthused. But we spoke to them a year later, and they felt a lot more sort of whetted, their appetites were whetted for doing something different. So, but at the same time, again, the dimension of the political settlement will not change that fast, and the underlying state capacities do not change very, very fast. So I don't think that we can be over optimistic about what we can see. So maybe I just say that for now.
Can I just push you on just one point? I think because I think in the paper it's quite central, and you're probably doing yourself an injustice, in being so summary about it. So one of the interesting things about the paper, right, is that it does try to bring together this question of political settlements and electoral political legitimacy, right? Which is that one of the weaknesses in that literature was precisely that, which is that every political settlement, even if it reflects an underlying distribution of power, you have to contend with the fact that it has to legitimize itself electorally, right? It has to get some coalition of 51 or whatever, right? And the question is, in the strategies that it uses to do that, even if it's not a revolutionary strategy, what space does that open up for, right? Both different interventions and different ideas and policies, right? So in that sense, it is a question which is, does democratic politics make a difference? And in the classic political settlement, the answer was no, actually it doesn't. That ultimately you would kind of revert to, unless there was some major structural shift, you would revert back to the mean, as it were, right? So you could say that Nitish 1 was a bit of an aberration. What you're actually beginning to see is a reversal to the mean, right? Depending, I mean, the issue is there, the time horizon, right, that you're actually sort of looking at. I guess in the context of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and I guess this is the question, which is it the case that, so there are broadly two ways of relating this, right? The political settlement to the electoral mobilization story. One way is the way you hint at in the paper, which is potentially productive, which is to say that, look, the state does have the means of creating something like a welfare coalition, right? And being able to sell that to the democratic public. So that's broadly what Raman Singh is sort of doing. He kind of suppresses Bastar, he has the extractive stuff going on, but he does enough, right? So welfare is that instrument. The other possibility is that the whole politics of welfare and the politics of production is completely detached or largely detached from the basis around which electoral mobilization takes place, right? So it could be ethnic identity, it could be Adivasi mobilization, it could be sort of, debates over who gets domicile certificates, right? Which have welfare implications but are not intrinsically one, right? So where do you see within those two contexts, not perhaps in the larger general context, right? Does electoral politics actually make a difference in the trajectory of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and how have the different political coalitions exploited those spaces?
Something quickly about that. I think maybe Louise will also be able to respond to that, because I think some of her recent work explores precisely that question about how, to what extent does was it a well-functioning welfare scheme actually impact and reduce the importance of clientelism? Wasn't that your? So that I'll request Louise to say something about that. But certainly, I mean, our sense is that a well-functioning PDS has played a big part in Raman Singh's electoral success, and to that extent that is absent in Jharkhand. And some of our earlier interviews in Jharkhand were quite a lot about how the sort of whole the mechanisms through which vote gathering actually works in Jharkhand seems to be so detached from who is doing what. It's all about your fixers and how they can actually buy your votes for you. But I have not investigated that robustly enough to be able to say that that doesn't happen in Chhattisgarh. So I'll say that.
Or pick up on anything else as
well. There's so much here that I don't think I can off the top of my head, but I think this point about strategies for electoral credibility is really, really fundamentally important, and for me it links to the question of the role of political leaders in producing change in inclusivity of development, if you like. I'm not sure I want to dwell too much on the other project you referred to, but very briefly, what we look at there is the extent to which well-functioning PDS system in Chhattisgarh has changed the nature of clientelistic relationships between local political leaders and voters, compared to Madhya Pradesh, where the PDS functions in a more traditional patronage-driven clientelistic sense. And what we find is that there are clear differences in the propensity of voters to respond to clientelistic inducements, vote buying, but very crudely across those two states, which seem to be linked to the reliability of the delivery of these basic public goods through the PDS system. So I do think that the strategies that political leaders use to seek electoral credibility, and Pratap, as you say, the extent to which those strategies map onto the dominant cleavages, if you like, in electoral competition, have very important consequences for the nature of welfare politics.
On what you said, Pratap, about the exogenous shock argument, I could turn the argument kind of on this opposite direction and say that in competitive title settlements, you don't really expect to see big exogenous shocks of wherever it might come in. And this is exactly that's why you're going to see incremental changes, as in PDS reform, and that's the best we can hope for. I mean, where exactly do we have examples of big shocks that have happened in continental settlements? And the Brazil example actually completely reinforces that point, because in Brazil, given the settlement that they had, there wasn't really much chance of using the windfall the commodity price boom to go for major structural transformation, because they didn't have the space, the proletariat didn't have the space they had in, say, in South Korea to bring about major radical changes in the economy, right? So I think that maybe the best we can hope for in the Indian context is exactly the type we see in Chhattisgarh, something to do with a scheme that changes something for the better. That's maybe what we should really hope for. And the big change we have seen in India, as was referred to, was economic reforms, which was not a discrete shift, as you argue, but a very gradualist process that happened over time. So maybe we shouldn't really be looking for these shifts, and we should be, I think we should really say that, given the kind of settlement we have in India, the best we can hope for is something like what we see in examples in Nitish in Bihar and Chhattisgarh and so on. So maybe I'm just wondering whether you really can.
I don't even disagree. So I think the context of that remark, right, which is that in the original political settlements literature, the idea was, and not just in the original political settlements literature, but in the broader kind of debate over, the institutionalists versus the social forces versus geography, right? They want to link all of these processes to some big outcome called development, right? So in that context, so in a sense, I'm actually agreeing with you that if you want to talk about development in that sense, right, where you actually say, are you onto a structural path with a different transformative trajectory? How rare those episodes actually are, right? because that's what the political settlement debate was, and the debate between the political settlement people, the institutionalists, was actually focused on, right? The target was explaining large variations in development. It was not explaining, does a state do one scheme better or two schemes better, right? So in that sense, I'm actually agreeing with you that I think what has dropped out of that and what needs is actually, maybe we shouldn't even frame it in terms of that larger discussion around development.
No, except to say that it'd be interesting to look at two countries which have achieved reasonable development transformations. And I don't know how, but China and South Korea. These were part of your analysis, were they? That's part of your program? I mean, they would be obvious candidates for this analysis because they're actually so then you could interpret it another way. I mean, because Pratap used the word exogenous shock, just to modify that a little bit. If you argue that a consistently higher growth trajectory shocks political institutions and therefore asks of a political settlement different ways of doing business, or alternatively arrests the atrophy of a political settlement, which is, I think, what the Prime Minister is saying today, that Mr. Palagaria says all the time, that if you have growth, everything will be well. So everything is going bananas, but just let's get growth. It's an argument. So so in that sense, you see, whether there are exogenous shocks or not, what you had in Brazil was being stuck in a middle income trap, so it actually ties into what Pratap is saying. Then you have a sort of brief, sort of off-cycle moment. Whereas what you have in many other developing countries is shocks that move you, since we're economists, trend to trend. The Gita Gopinath paper shows that quite well. It's not a cyclical thing. So in that sense, I suppose what you're saying, the sense I'm getting from your paper is that what you're saying is that Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh are both caught on trend. And since they're both caught on trend, Chhattisgarh does relatively better than Jharkhand in delivering on trend. That is, taking things up and down the trend, but neither is necessarily automatically transformative.
I have the last one.
Great, and then it moves to the next panel. No, I just wanted to actually pick up on exactly this point. This is a struggle that we had with this comparison, is because the outcome in these two states are really not that different, and one being on poverty, one is the poorest state in the country, and one is the one above it. And so really, and this is part of what Kunal also says, that I think there is some value to the meso-level theorization that this sort of framework allows one to do. Otherwise, we will get caught up in arguments of if we don't see, sort of, let's say, even in extraction, if the larger extractive logic or primitive accumulation isn't particularly being challenged or turned upside down either of these two states, why does it matter? But I think it does, precisely because this functions within this sort of democratic electoral framework within which both these states are very centrally positioned within it. And I think there is value to theorizing the incremental gradual changes, and I think that's part of what we have attempted to do. So I think it's just to reinforce why the meso level, perhaps in my mind, also matters, and maybe that's where the political settlements research is really situated, although we may want it to do other things. So
okay, well, thank you very much, particularly all the panelists, for a great start. And we now take a break, right? So we take a break. Please be here at, I'd say, 5 to 12, so that we can actually get started by noon for the second. Okay, if you can try and keep it to 15, so we can probably start around 20 minutes from now. So we have more time for discussion in the next panel. Thanks so much.